Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen, and ta-da! Look who's here. Welcome to Larry Jordan, author of this unbelievable book, The Real Marilyn Monroe. Thank you for coming, Larry.
Helen, I have been looking forward to it for months. As a matter of fact, I've been sitting by my phone day after day waiting for you to call me.
Oh, stop
you're just
it.
so busy, you just don't have time.
Stop it. So we really have been struggling to find a mutual time. Life is just so annoying. So I'm really grateful to you for your time. I know that there's a lot going on for you. I, on the other hand, have no life. So this.
Oh, come on. Now, I think you've done the last count 364 videos. Oh, this one may end your career, but we'll see.
No. People love this book.
Very good. Thank you.
Loved it. And it's so exhaustively researched. I can't believe it. So my first comment to you is, until I read this book, I had less than zero interest in Marilyn Monroe. Your wonderful daughter, who I will now push her book.
Oh, yes.
Dorothy Kilgallen, this incredible book here by Sarah Jordan Hines. The Jordan, that's the Jordan. Mm-hmm. And I eventually want to talk to you about the parallels, because it's a little creepy, isn't it? Yeah, it's a little creepy. Yeah. When I did her book, she mentioned that you were almost ready to finish this book on Marilyn. And I said, well, I'd love to cover it because of your relationship with your daughter. I don't care about Marilyn Monroe. However, you converted me. After reading this book, I was absolutely stunned. I assumed she was a blonde dope. I assumed that she made a handful of various stereotypically misogynistic movies. I never understood the appeal. I get tired. I think it's tedious. The people who dress up like her all the time, it's just like, come on, Yeah. After reading about her life, what I'm attracted to is not the image of the Marilyn, because she actually considered that a persona. That wasn't the real self, right? The genuine person behind it, the Norma Jean behind it. That's what really struck me. So having preached at you now, let's first talk about you. I want to know about your background, where you came from, how you got into writing, all of it.
I could go as far back as when I was 11 years old and eating cereal one morning, Rice Chex cereal, and on the back of the cereal box was a little newspaper for children. And I was intrigued by that. And apparently we went through a lot of cereal in our house because there was always an updated version of that little Rice Chex newspaper. And for Christmas in 1963, my parents got me a little printing set. And I started putting out a little newspaper. I graduated to a mimeographed newspaper using my church's mimeograph machine. They taught me how to use it. And I would go there after the secretary left for the day. I would put out a little biweekly mimeograph paper. And when I was 15, I graduated to a professional tabloid. Keep in mind, I was still in school at that time.
Yeah.
And I put out an 8 to 12 page tabloid newspaper that was run off by a small daily newspaper. I had to do all of the paste ups, the writing. I sold the ads and so forth. And I was for a while known as Iowa's youngest editor. And I did that for 5 years, even into college stage.
I had no idea. That's interesting.
I was a minor, so I couldn't be sued. So I was kind of a muckraker of sorts. I found out scandals involving a former politician for the city. I grew up in Cedar Rapids in eastern Iowa. And it was fun because I would skip school, and if I couldn't get it run off on a Saturday, and I would take a Greyhound bus 33 miles to Vinton, Iowa, where there was a small daily newspaper. I would work there that day, putting the finishing touches on the layouts. I don't know if you know what paste ups are, but a lot of people do. Laboriously putting all the page design.
Yeah, I was on the school newspaper in college, and that was slowly phasing out. They were slowly becoming
And
computerized. Yeah.
by the end of the day, they would be running it off just ahead of their daily paper. And I was printing, I think, 2,500, 3,000 copies. It finally got bigger than that. But then they would put boxes or cartons of newspapers together so that when the Greyhound bus came through again later in the day, around 7 o'clock, they would load the boxes in the cargo hold of the bus, and I would go back to Cedar Rapids. And the next day, I would go around. My mother would take me around. My mother was widowed. My father died when I was 13.
Oh.
And she would take me by car, and I'd go to the various drugstores and other retail locations where bundles of my newspaper were sold. And I got a lot of publicity that way. I wasn't trying, but I remember delivering one night, getting home exhausted, and turned on the 10 o'clock news. And one of my stories was the lead story of WMT Channel 2. And it happened to be about this former mayor who was trying to get a position with the city again. And he was kind of a shyster mayor. And
which is kind of redundant, but go ahead.
He threatened me. He made the mistake of doing that on the phone, and I taped the conversation and then recorded it next to his verbatim quote. He was very livid. But anyway, I had befriended a guy that was a mentor of mine that I still hold up to very high esteem, the late Tom Riley. He was a state senator. He was also one of America's greatest trial lawyers. He won major judgment awards against huge cases like the tampon case that you heard about, toxic shock syndrome.
Oh, toxic shock. Oh,
yeah.
Yes,
He was the lawyer, and he went up against this field of big, high-powered lawyers. He prevailed. Volkswagen of America. Anyway, he was quite an incredible guy, a great public servant. I worked in 3 of his congressional campaigns as a speechwriter and issue strategist. He served as kind of my ad hoc lawyer. He didn't charge me for it, but he would preview stories that I was planning to run in my newspaper, which I ran from the age of, 15 and for 5 years. So if I sensed that there would be anything that might be a little bit controversial, he would peruse it before it went to press.
Can I interrupt you to ask you something?
Yeah.
Who was the reading public?
The reading public. I mean, it was just general people, citizens of Cedar Rapids. It was a fairly complete. If I had it handy, I'd show you a copy. I do have bound volumes of these, and I did it religiously every other week while going to school. A neighbor built what's called a light table, which is a big 8-foot-long thing for paste up, and I had that in my bedroom. And anyway, I got a lot of Editor and Publisher magazine, which is kind of the Bible of the newspaper industry, did a 2-page spread on me. I got coverage all over. But people started to take my publication seriously. And I was able to attract large advertisers, a large local realtor, a large memorial parks, a funeral home. These people were buying ads from me.
Wow.
So
wow.
It was a lot of fun and I kind of facilitated my ability to do that by teaching myself how to type when I was 11. My mother had taken a night school course and bought a Royal Upright typewriter. I got to
still have it.
I got to show you this because it really is true. I'm not joking about this.
Okay, so this is the Antique Roadshow,
This is
right?
from 11 years of age.
Wow.
This is the typewriter. So I'm not kidding.
Very familiar.
And I feel like this is show and tell, and probably not the best way to get started on a interview about Marilyn, but it gives you a little idea that I've been at this game for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And I have published other. I did a tabloid newsprint magazine for a while, and then for 26 years I was the publisher up until a few years ago of Midwest Today, which was a glossy regional general interest publication. It's the one that Sarah also appeared in.
Right.
So I've been at this profession, which I've always regarded as an honorable profession, although I've been increasingly chagrined at the tendency of corporate media to take over what they feed the American public, and it's no longer a public service endeavor. It's just a profit-making endeavor.
Oh, it's horrendous. Freedom of the press has just become essentially meaningless because even if you're allowed to print something, and they're very careful about how they control that, the selection of stories available, how do I put this? Like you said, it's corporate. It's all about the profit that it'll make, the number of people who will pay attention. Has nothing to do with the quality of the content or actually telling people about what's happening.
Absolutely. I think journalism standards have declined. The University of Iowa has a great school of journalism. As a matter of fact, when I was doing, even as a late teenager, the original tabloid that I was speaking of, I was walking down the hallway one day and one of the professors corralled me and asked me to come in and speak to the class, which was a little daunting because these were J students that were pretty advanced and they were asking me questions. But there was an era of our country where journalism was respected and truth was paramount. To me, and this is speaking in general terms of life, truth is at the heart of everything. If you do not have truth, what do you have?
Yeah,
you have nothing to build on if it's not truth. And we're not getting truth from media, and we're not getting truth from Marilyn Monroe authors. To bring it
to take it back to the book. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's like this Gordian knot of baloney, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I have a little question for you. How did you get attracted to the topic of Marilyn Monroe?
I'm a baby boomer, so I grew up seeing her on TV and little movie clips.
Yeah.
And I was, up until third grade, very deficient in reading, which is hard to understand because my mother was a teacher. She was not active the entire time I was growing up, but she was an excellent teacher. She had taught one-room country school in Iowa.
Well, did you know, I'm going to interrupt you because I think this is really important for people to know, that actually developmentally, it's within the bounds of normalcy for especially boys to really not take off with reading until they're 9 or 10.
I didn't
People
realize.
worry about that. It's not actually all that beyond the scope of normal.
I knew that, I do recall that a third grade teacher, Mrs. Oldorf, had a parent-teacher conference, and she said, Larry is a smart boy, but he's behind grade level on reading. So this teacher, I give her credit. She worked with me. My mother did too, but she really brought me up to not only reading level, grade reading level, but beyond. I remember going to a library one time on a field trip, and I didn't have any interest in any of the books, and they handed me a book on frogs, which I couldn't have cared less about. So if it hadn't been for that teacher really giving me individual attention, I might have turned into some other profession or whatever. But I became a voracious reader. So then I even took courses in speed reading. So I still practice that today, a lot of speed reading.
Evelyn Woods?
Search. Pardon me?
Evelyn Woods?
I don't know if that was the course. It was actually a course through in junior high. It was one of the courses.
Oh, that's interesting. So what was your favorite book when you finally got used to it as a child and liked it?
I'm a strange person in the sense that I do not like fiction. I think the last fictional book I read was so many years ago. I think it was predicated on the movie Airplane.
Yeah.
That's a long time ago. And I have a little confession, and maybe will embarrass my precious daughter. She's written a number of fictional works. I've scanned them. I've not completed reading them. And she knows her dad. I don't read fiction.
Yeah.
So I'm really, hung up on nonfiction, which underscores the fact that when I write a book, and I've written several, I don't put anything in there that's fluff or wild speculation or outright lies. And unfortunately, that is not a standard that prevails in the book publishing industry today.
Yeah.
If you can sell books, believe me, these big publishers are all for it. They're not going to fact check you, and they don't care.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, but you didn't tell me what your favorite book was.
Yeah, I have a hard time doing it. There's a favorite book that you will find very strange that it would be my favorite. Of course, I was a fan of Lincoln, so I enjoyed reading like Carl Sandburg and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an author by the name of Gladys Tabor, whom a lot of people don't know, but she was a
Sounds
columnist.
familiar. What did she write?
Well, she was a professor of English in New York City many years ago, like in the 1930s. And she had a couple of children. She befriended a woman who had a child also. And the two women decided that their families, they were, of course, both had husbands, needed a retreat from New York. So they found a 1780s era farmhouse in Connecticut and they restored it. And it became their family's weekend retreat. Then at some point, the husbands died, and the women decided not to keep their children in New York. So they moved lock, stock, and barrel to the farm.
Yeah.
And Gladys started writing magazine articles about the changing of the seasons, life's simple pleasures, everything from food to nature. And these became very, very popular books. There's sort of a cult following. I still have them in my home library today. And when life gets too stressful, I will pick up one of Gladys Tabor's books. And they are organized according to the months of the year. So here we are in March, and I could pick that up and read
that's
what's going
so
on.
interesting.
And their farm was called Still Meadow. In fact, it still exists, although there's been the encroachment of urban development around it. But you could find it online. And Still Meadow Sampler is a book I would recommend. Gladys Tabor, she wrote with such poetry and color. She was a superb writer.
You know what this reminds me of, and I know it's not connected at all, but it just triggered a memory. I saw a movie with Barbara Stanwyck, and she plays the part
Christmas in Connecticut.
Yes.
Yes. And you know what? That was somewhat predicated on the real life Gladys Tabor.
That's
Except
yes.
It was in Connecticut and everything. And but Gladys was the real deal. She could really.
She actually was genuine. Barbara Stanwyck.
And she did in her books and her columns have recipes too,
Yeah. How to cook fancy dinner.
Or how to be a homemaker. And it was an honorable endeavor. It was nothing sexist about it.
I'm so excited you know that.
Yeah, it's very funny, but they kind of perverted that story to make, Barbara Stanwyck be a bit inept and have to fake, for her publisher that she was a great.
Wasn't that a great movie?
I loved it.
It was wonderful. Okay. All right. So that leads to the next question I have for you. What was your favorite Marilyn Monroe movie?
The one with Jack Lemmon.
Some Like It Hot.
Curtis.
Some Like It Hot. That's my favorite.
I report in the book that movie critics have, I believe, dubbed that like the greatest comedy of all time.
Yeah. That's my favorite by far. I hated Bus Stop. Hated it. After I read the book, I went back and watched some of her movies because I wanted to know what I was critiquing, Hated Bus Stop. I don't like movies that are created from stage plays. I never like them. That pacing is wrong. I don't like them.
Interestingly enough, I think Marilyn regarded it as a pretty good movie.
Oh, she thought it was the best movie she ever made.
Yeah.
Because why? Because she really wanted to be a stage actress.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
why. As a report in my book, she was a stage actress.
Yes. Yeah.
People don't realize that.
Yeah.
I don't see that in a lot of other Marilyn books. But she did do some theatrical stuff early in her career.
She got offered we'll get to it, but she got offers, to be on Broadway.
Yeah.
She was no slouch. She created this persona and then people bought it. I bought it.
Mm-hmm.
And then didn't give her credit for the real person she was. It was a substantial person. So you don't have to answer this if this is too personal, but you dedicated the book. We haven't even gotten past the dedication. You dedicated the book to Bill Larson.
And time is running out. So no.
We're going to do more of these. So you dedicated your book to Bill Larson. Why? Who was Bill Larson?
Bill Larson was a pilot. I ran across his name when I was researching and writing a 672-page book called Jim Reeves, The Untold Story. And Jim Reeves was a
football player or a runner?
Pardon me?
What was he, like an athlete?
Jim Reeves was a singer, a progenitor of the Nashville sound. He had such a rich baritone voice and was such a flawless singer. And he came into Nashville around the time the sound was changing from the twangy country style. And he had strings, he had oboes, he had all these instruments on his recording sessions. He had songs like Four Walls, Welcome to My World, You'll Have to Go. And when I was 13, I wrote a fan letter to Mary Reeves, and she wrote back very long. His widow, Jim, was killed in a plane crash in 1964 on the outskirts of Nashville. But anyway, I got acquainted with Mary when I was 13. She had written me back on Monday, September 12th of 1966. My father, who was a big Jim Reeves fan, died 3 days later. And I wrote to tell her that I was glad that he lived long enough to have read Mary Reeves's reply. And this must have touched her heart because we began writing back and forth every other week. Oh. So to synopsize, I knew her for 33 years until she passed away in 1999. She was another mentor of mine, but I became very familiar with Jim Reeves's catalog. I also knew a lot about him, and I befriended people that were in his band and so forth. And a guy wrote a terrible, terrible book, a trash book on Jim that I was so appalled by, I decided to do my own book. And it took 13 years to do that. I had to do that in my spare time. I taped over 500 interviews. And there was one guy I wanted to talk to, Bill Larson, who was a pilot. The reason I wanted to talk to him is he was mentioned in a Nashville newspaper account of Jim's plane crash. And I knew that he had been a close friend of Jim's, but I could not find him. He was retired. And I was getting ready to publish the book in 2011 when one day I get this email out of the blue from who other than Bill Larson. And he was wanting to get in touch with one of the Blue Boys, a member of Jim's band, who sadly had just passed away 2 days earlier. And I said, well, Mr. Larson, I've been searching for you. And thereupon began a long-term friendship. And I used to call him my Uncle Bill because we talked daily. He became more infirm because of a car accident that severely injured his back and affected his mobility. So he was homebound to a large extent. But he was right in there pitching. He not only helped me on the Jim Reeves plane crash, or the story, because he had flown the plane that Jim crashed in the day before. And he had been an airline pilot for Eastern Airlines for 30 years. This guy was really a knowledgeable flyer from the days of the Constellations to the 747s. So he helped and helped. And when Marilyn came along, he would call me up daily and ask, how's Marilyn? And I would bounce off of him different things that I found.
Oh, so he was a little bit your mentor, your sounding board.
Well, I told him that I would, and I read the dedication to him. Sadly, when I was leaving Florida, my adopted home state, and was moving back up to Iowa, he was trying to get a hold of me, but I had my phone notifications turned off for messages. And when I arrived, I retrieved the messages, and 7 of them were from Bill. Very calm, just please give me a call. When I did, I found out he had passed away while I was en route. But I felt good that he had read parts of the book, and he was a guiding force, and he was very objective and very outspoken. So if he thought my article or my chapter was not up to par, he didn't
call you on it. Yeah. Well, you know, I'm just so curious because you did mention him. Oh, and you know what? I realized why I thought Jim Reeves was an athlete. I was thinking about Jim Thorpe. Duh, you know, I'm terrible with names. So I have a little side question for you. You mentioned you started out in Iowa, you're back in Iowa. It didn't click for me. And now I brought to mind this case I just did a video on, and I spoke with the private detective who investigated it, which was really interesting. I've never spoken to a PI before. It was pretty exciting. Are you familiar with the case of Jody Husentrut?
I know it well.
Oh, this may be a separate video.
Yes, wasn't she Mason City? TV
Yes.
reporter.
We're
Right.
going to talk about this. Let's
Yeah.
set that aside. We're going to
Yeah,
talk about
definitely.
that. But let's move on with Marilyn. So many deaths, so little
Yes.
time. So let's talk about the parallels between your work and Sarah's work, if that's not too personal.
Mhm.
I was so struck about, you know, you started out in a newspaper and journalism and got your daughter interested in it. The book she writes is about a woman who started working with her father, a journalist, and I just thought that was so interesting.
It is.
And then full circle, some of the characters towards the end of Marilyn's story were somewhat adjacent to the people in the Dorothy Kilgallen story. How weird is that?
Well, I can give you a very vivid example of that.
Okay.
And that is, a lot of people who have followed Marilyn know the name Bob Slatzer or Slatzer, however you pronounce that name.
Yeah.
That's Latzer. He surfaced around the time that there was a pretense of launching a reinvestigation of Marilyn's death after there was a book by Norman Mailer that was a crap book. But anyway, it renewed public interest, and Bob Slatzer took advantage of it. He was an aspiring screenwriter, and anyway, he came forth with a lot of allegations, including the ludicrous premise that Marilyn was going to hold a press conference on Monday. And we can talk about that in another video.
Right.
But what I found out, and that I don't think has appeared in any other book, is that Bob Slatzer and Ron Pataki were roommates.
That blew my mind.
And Ron Pataki was, as Sarah's described, a very mercurial person. In her new book, The Incredible Life and Mysterious Death of Dorothy Kilgallen, Dorothy has the exclusive on the fact that Ron Pataki had a connection to the CIA. And she's already explained that to you.
Yeah, the whole Cuba, Bay of Pigs, CIA.
And I had, after Sarah's article came out in Midwest Today, Ron continued to call our office, and I developed a informal friendship, if you could call it that, or acquaintanceship with him. And he would call periodically and we'd shoot the breeze. And that's how, and I think Sarah made a point of that in talking to you, that's how I was able to glean a lot of information. I will confess that as a reporter, I've always had a tape recorder on my desk, ready to push the button. A lot of reasons why that has worked out well over the years. But I recorded the conversations with Ron Pataki. And having lived in a state in which it only requires one participant in the conversation, it's entirely legal.
Yeah.
Anyway, he softened up and became more comfortable with me. And so he revealed things that no other author, especially the much celebrated guy that has turned Dorothy into a cottage industry, he certainly didn't earn any favors from Ron Pataki. But the bottom line was, one day I was talking to Ron, and he brought up Marilyn Monroe. It was the farthest thing from my mind. And he brought up his friend Bob Slatzer. And he claimed that Marilyn would call Bob periodically, and once in a while Ron Pataki would answer the phone. And I said, is that really true? And he said, well, I know that Bob and Marilyn were bunkmates for a while. All of that is total BS, if I may say that. Bob Slatzer he was actually a book reviewer for the Ohio newspaper, and he got Ron Pataki the job, as Sarah has related. But he was basically, and I hate to say it this way, a lowly book reviewer. I mean, he didn't have some great stature.
You're talking about Ron or?
Well, I'm talking about Bob Slatzer.
Slatzer
was a book reviewer.
Okay.
I mean, that's not exactly top echelon at a newspaper.
Right. Yeah.
And he got Ron Pataki a job as an entertainment reviewer.
Yeah.
But what is the symbiotic relationship between these two men? What are the odds that Bob Slatzer, he did befriend Marilyn at one point because he wrote a guest column for Dorothy Kilgallen back in the 50s in which he recounted that he had met Marilyn and they started doing a book exchange where he would recommend literature that she was interested in, and he thought she might be interested in, and vice versa. And he made clear that it was an affair of the mind not an affair of the heart, nothing physical. He made that clear himself. But then he turned around and sold a smutty story to Confidential magazine. And I guarantee you that when he did that, he burned his bridge with Marilyn. He had no entree into Marilyn's life thereafter. But he knew enough about her and was obsessed enough about her, even married a woman who looked like her, that he saw his opportunity in 1982 to jump into the game. And so he took real life elements of Marilyn's life and mixed them with his embroidered, fanciful elaborations. And that's the worst kind. That's really fictionalized biography, and I detest that because you can't tell where the truth ends and the fantasy begins.
And it becomes entrenched in cultural lore, and so difficult to separate it from the truth and the lies. Separate them.
I can't figure out how it's possible that these two guys would be roommates, and Ron Pataki was involved in the Dorothy Kilgallen death, and Ron Pataki and Bob Sleitzer, was somehow insinuated, at least in part, in Marilyn Monroe. What are the odds of that?
It's so bizarre. Well, I just wanted to point out that one of the personality constructs of psychopathy is pathological lying. Just FYI. Yeah. Okay, so
I can't imagine who you're referring to, but okay.
Well, the list is long.
Yes.
Some people are way at the top, but the list is long. So here's my endless conundrum. I spend a lot of time wondering. Well, I don't spend a lot of time, but I often wonder about this.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about Marilyn Monroe that makes people become so obsessed with her? Now, I shared with you that for me, it was the quality of her character, the kind of person she really was behind the image. Mm-hmm. But some people are just obsessed with that persona. What is that?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. First of all, she was indeed a unique personality. None of the Marilyn imitators have ever come close to really impersonating her. But she also had a tragic ending, and I think people sense that. They sense that, like the assassination of a president, they're not letting that go either. And it's, I think, an obsession that will never die. There are other great stars of Hollywood, John Wayne, and just name any of them. None of them are as omnipresent as Marilyn.
Well, that name wouldn't be on the top of my list.
Well, and I think that one of the key factors was her vulnerability, and it was so apparent. And also, Marilyn really got beat up by the press at some point of her life, toward the latter part of her life. And I detail that very thoroughly in my book. I don't think other authors have really exposed to the reading public just how vicious the press was in the final weeks of her life. And I propose a rational explanation for why I believe that was. But anyway, so I can't give you a really simple answer other than the fact that she was just this luminescent personality. People often use that word, curiously enough, to describe her who met her in public, in person. And so there's this whole thing swirling around. She makes you care about her. As someone said, it's an act of will to look at anybody else on the screen when she's in the camera shot. If you have several people there, all about Eve, are you looking at, Betty Davis, or who are you're looking
at?
Well,
I have to admit, I love Betty Davis, but I understand what you're saying. There's an element of truth to that for sure. Well, the quote from Gloria Steinem, she was what all men want and what all women fear. Is that how it went?
I'm not sure that that's correct.
She personified the hopes of men and the fears of women.
I'm not even sure fears was in it, but everybody thought they could rescue her. A man felt when he looked at Marilyn, if only I had befriended her, I could have rescued this poor soul. And women, I think, innately felt their vulnerability because a lot of that buildup of her personality occurred during a period when men's and women's roles were very different than they are today. A lot of women were not working outside the house, they were working in the house as homemakers. and they admired Marilyn's career aspirations
Yeah.
and achievements, because
Yeah.
after all, she bucked the Hollywood system.
Yeah. See, I feel it's the opposite of what Gloria Steinem said. I think men feared her because she was independent and powerful, and women really admired that.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about her early life, and don't worry, I'm not going to put you on the spot. This is more general kinds of questions, because I've been thinking about it a lot. Like, what are the topics about this that jump out? You go through just microscopic detail about names and places and dates and events and chronologies. We don't need to rehash that. People need to read the book. Everybody, read the book.
I endorse that idea.
Talk about the broader issues. So I asked myself a lot reading this book, where did she get her strength? She had such a horrible childhood. Now, I'll warn you, there are certain words you can't say on YouTube.
Sure.
The kind of trauma she experienced as a child, you can't say those words. So we're just going to call it her childhood trauma.
Right.
And I think people know what we're talking about if they don't read the book. She just had a very unwell family, and terrible traumatic things happened to her multiple times. And, her mother and her grandmother both tried to,
right.
Oh my God. I thought it was so interesting that she had trouble staying asleep. Not falling asleep, staying asleep.
Yes.
Because she would wake from these terrible nightmares, not able to breathe. Gee, yes. I wonder why that was.
Mm-hmm. Well, both of her grandparents on her mother's side ended up in mental institutions.
Yeah.
The grandfather too, not just the grandmother.
And an uncle too, right?
To try to do it. Pardon me?
Was it an uncle or brother?
I think there was another family member too. I'd have to actually go back and read that. But then, of course, Gladys, her mother, was in and out of it. Yeah. But I also propound a possible contribution to that state of affairs in the sense that Gladys had been a film editor working around what are now known to be toxic chemicals, and people can experience brain damage. The parallel to that, interestingly enough, is that after Marilyn got married, she was still Norma Jean then, she worked at a radio plant.
Yeah.
She was in a room where they were spraying chemicals. Mm-hmm. So there's even a possibility that that may have impacted to some extent her biological health. It certainly couldn't have been good.
Yeah, it creates neurological issues. But
she certainly, and she claimed that to friends and others, that she actually remembered the incident that we don't need to go into detail of when her grandmother made an attempt on her life. And
she was quite young.
She was very young. Yes. Yeah. And, I do believe that because I bet you have, I certainly have, very, very early memories of when I was like 2 and 3 years old.
It's interesting, Larry. There are people who don't. Now, I do. I can remember back. My mother is dead now, but I would, and I have an interesting environment because I've been removed from all of the people who knew me as a child, a very young child. Mm-hmm. So nobody is feeding me these stories, right? Mm-hmm. And I asked my mother about this. One thing I remembered, and I was very young, standing in a pram, looking out a window, waiting for my father to come home. And I asked my mother, where was that when that happened? And she said, you don't remember that. And I said, but I do, yeah. She said, Helen, how could you remember that? You were probably about a year old. Mm-hmm. But I do remember that.
Yes.
So, okay.
And it's interesting that and this is really jumping fast forward, we haven't introduced, for the benefit of people who have not read the book, the name Ralph Roberts, but he was like the brother Marilyn didn't have.
Yeah.
He was a part-time masseur, but he also, and he knew the who's who of show business, believe me. Mm-hmm. He was also a part-time actor, and he appeared in a lot of different things. But when he reflected in his private notes that I have copies of.
You spoke with him, right?
Well, I didn't speak with him because he died several years ago. But I was able to acquire copies of his handwritten and typewritten notes from his nephew. And what was interesting to me is that when he recalled the day that Marilyn died, he was in his car and he heard the bulletin. And then he reflected in his notes that he felt this feeling of smothering in his reaction. And then he recounted how Marilyn commented to him on more than one occasion. She was not afraid of heights. My goodness, the woman was bi-coastal. She flew back and forth. You know, she was a jet setter before there were jets, by the way, in a lot of those years. She had a 13-story apartment in New York, so she wasn't afraid of heights. You've even seen her leaning over a balcony, which you could not pay me enough to do because I don't like heights. But she was afraid of one thing above all, and that was smothering.
Smothering, yeah, that struck me.
And she would wake up in the middle of the night with afraid, and she didn't even like to use a pillow in her bed.
And thinking about the book, how her life unfolded, the different issues she had in her life. I'm no psychological expert, no mental health professional here, but to me, it is glaringly obvious. This is a person who suffered severe, particular childhood trauma very young. It's obvious, don't you think?
Yes, I think it's obvious. It's not obvious to Donald Spoto, an author. It's not obvious to Norman Mailer, who said that she made a lot of this stuff up.
Yeah, those guys are misogynists.
It is obvious to me.
I think it's inarguable, and they're just uninformed misogynists. We don't need to pay attention to them. And then she got married when she was 16. And the adults in her life kind of pushed her into it, right?
Well, it was the Goddard family, and her Grace Goddard had gotten married, as I understand it. And I think they were going to move out of state. I have to refresh my memory on that. But it also was difficult. Marilyn didn't want to leave California, et cetera. But she would be fated to go back into the, foster home system, which was a nightmare. And there was this cute guy, Jimmy Doherty, who was a little bit older. He had a fancy car. He occasionally gave her a lift. He had a girlfriend, steady girlfriend. But Grace Goddard and another woman approached him and said, well, how would you like to marry if she's in this jam here? So she, in a sense, was forced to it. They did have a little bit of a courtship. And I think that in the early days, she actually did trust him and grew to love him to the extent that she could. I believe that he commented that she was so clingy at the wedding before the ceremony was even completed that she was like cutting off the circulation of one of his arms by gripping him so hard. But you can kind of understand why that was. She was afraid it was going to fall through, that she was not going to be rescued. So in a sense, he fulfilled a rescue fantasy. And then you know what he did. This Jim Doherty enlisted in the military without telling his new bride.
Yeah.
If that doesn't pull the rug out from underneath someone like her, I don't know what does.
Somebody who's really desperate for stability and predictability and to do that behind her back, and it entails moving and being here and being there and not having personal agency over where you live and
well, it wasn't even that so much, because she left her behind in California, and but he did ultimately get a position as an athletic instructor on Catalina Island. And I know you know what Catalina Island is.
Oh my God. When I read that, I thought, well, that's not so bad.
And, he recounts, I quote him in the book as saying that when he called Norma Jean, as he knew her, to tell her that they were going to move to Catalina Island, he'd gotten a position there. You could have heard her from on shore, her elation. She was yelling, in such jubilation. And it worked out pretty well for her, but she soon caught the eye of all these buff guys, military guys, who noticed her around the beach. And I kind of think that exacerbated Jim Doherty's frustrations. But then, of course, he was transferred to the South Pacific, and she was truly alone. And she had to end up at one point living with her in-laws. And his mother, Doherty's mother, did not approve of Norma Jean's aspirations to become a model. And you know the story about how that came about kind of by accident. When she was in 1944, it's been misreported it was 45. It's actually 1944, when David Conover, who was in the military, was assigned by none other than Ronald Reagan, who served stateside, never saw foreign service, by the way, even though he claimed he did. But anyway, Ronald Reagan had dispatched David Conover to take pictures of attractive women on the assembly line who were doing, contributing to the war effort.
Rosie the Riveter type
That
stuff.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he spotted this attractive but rather plain looking young woman, wholesome woman, and proposed that she posed for him during her lunch hour. And the rest is history. He ended up showing pictures to her, to Emmeline Snively. Is it Shively, Snively? Sometimes I miss these names. Who ran Blue Book Modeling, and the rest is history.
I was really struck by her work ethic and her ambition. She never rested on her laurels, it was so, and from young, and people who go through the kinds of trauma that she experienced often are they're kind of at loose ends. They're kind of,
absolutely.
Yeah. It really struck me that she had that kind of, determination and drive and stick-to-itiveness. What do you suppose gave her that?
I think that there are a few people like Johnny Hyde, who was an agent, 31 years her senior, who fell in love with her. She refused to marry him. By the way, I'll just be blunt about it. She did not climb the ladder by dating men.
No, she turned down big money people all
absolutely.
the time.
Joe Schenck, it's a hard name to pronounce, who co-founded with Daryl Zanuck 20th Century Fox, was very.
Can I interrupt you just for a second?
Yeah.
I just had a revelation.
Yeah.
I'm getting chills. I'm doing another book coming up fairly soon, and I won't go into great detail. I like to keep it a little bit of a surprise, but it involves early Hollywood, Joe Schenck and Adolf Zucker and those guys. And I didn't remember. I didn't make the connection. It didn't even dawn on me. Isn't that just odd?
Well, Joe Schenck he had a palace. I've seen pictures of it. In fact, Marilyn was even photographed by Milton Green there on this grand staircase. It was the most opulent home you could imagine. And he would have Sunday dinners and invite the, famous Hollywood stars. So here was this little aspiring actress who hadn't really accomplished anything, but he kind of took her under her wing and invited her to these different things. But, her career still faltered. She did not have a great acceleration of her career then.
No, it was hard work. She had really hard work.
Yes. And, I think it's important to note that she, by virtue of appearing, David Conover took the pictures. He showed her picture to other people. Her first magazine cover was Yank magazine, military magazine. It was in 1946.
Oh, phew. I was worried there for a minute.
No, it wasn't one of those magazines. And then it was followed by Stars and Stripes, which is still published today. And so she was visible. She was universally visible. And it was really the fact that she struck people. She had so many different ways of posing and could look different. They could even give a different name to her, identify her under a different name. Yeah. And it would fool people because she looked so different, depending upon her hair color and her mood, her manners, and all that, that she was a very versatile subject for a model.
That kind of chameleon ability is also a survival technique that people that suffer childhood trauma develop, this ability to blend into the background, be whatever you think you are looking at. Yeah.
And she was able to get an introduction to Ben Lyon, whom I credit for tremendously getting her career going. Marilyn, in one summer, and she did a bunch of odd jobs. It wasn't just modeling, but she did a whole bunch of different things. There was an opportunity for her to caddy one summer for a guy named John Carroll, and his wife was Lucille Ryman, who happened to be a talent agent who had helped somebody you may have heard of named June Allison and Lana Turner. But anyway, Marilyn was induced to sign a brief contract with them. They made some introductions. Ultimately, anyway, there was an agent a publicist, who played a little trick on Ben Lyon and said that Howard Hughes had seen Marilyn or Norma Jean on a magazine cover and 20th Century Fox is getting ready to sign her. So, or vice versa, maybe it was the other way around. I think she played that game with, Ben Lyon, and said Howard Hughes was getting ready to sign her,
Yeah.
because he was a movie mogul also. So Ben hurriedly agreed to see Norma Jean, and he did an unauthorized screen test and slipped it in the next time that Daryl Zanuck was looking at
The
screen
rushes.
tests.
Yeah.
And she got hired. But of course,
Real estate agents do that. Every time you
yeah,
look at a house, they tell you, "Oh, well, somebody's ready to make an offer."
right.
It's
So
very
anyway, it's
funny.
kind of serendipitous how things unfolded. But you were making the point earlier that she was very ambitious, and Ben Lyon made that point. He said a lot of young people, he even said this to Marilyn herself, and he helped name her, by the way. She chose the last name of Monroe because that was her mother's original maiden name. And Marilyn was suggested, I think, by the name Marilyn by Ben
Marilyn
Lyon.
Monroe.
But he commented that unlike other young aspiring stars who would sleep until noon and be out partying at the night, Marilyn was not like that. And she had a very full schedule, which I'm sure you remember reading
Yeah.
about in the book.
Yeah.
She took horseback riding lessons. She took fencing lessons. She took dancing lessons. She took singing lessons. She took all these lessons, anything and everything. And that actually did impress Emmeline Snidely, also the gal that was getting her bookings for modeling assignments, because this was atypical. But Marilyn explained it by saying that she wanted to be ready if and when opportunity knocked.
Oh, smart.
Indeed,
Yeah.
it knocked.
She didn't turn down stupid jobs either. I was struck by, didn't she travel to Salinas or Gilmore or something? Didn't she get elected like Miss Garlic or some silly
all
thing?
kinds of these things.
Yeah.
In fact, her first modeling assignment was actually to be present at a convention where they were selling office equipment. And there's a picture in my book of her standing next to like a 4-drawer safe that you keep papers in. And that's all she had to do is just model that and show it to people at a convention. So she wasn't even, it didn't even appear in a photograph for that one per se, but she was willing to basically do anything. And people who didn't even know her name, but were struck by her beauty, her luminescence, we'll say again, wanted to know who she was. And they would even write the studios when she had little walk-on parts and say, who is that woman? So she had a romance with the camera. And that's hard to come by. I think that's a natural ability.
Well, the camera had a romance with her.
Right,
The camera loved her.
right.
Yeah.
And she knew how to do it. What is curious is she was at ease in front of the still camera, but nervous, very frightful in front of a movie camera.
Well, isn't it because she felt like so many millions of people were watching in the moment kind of situation?
That, and I think that she also was induced to believe that she didn't know how to act, when in fact she came by it natively. And if she'd been left alone, and I go into great detail about some of her acting coaches,
oh my God,
particularly the
horrible,
Strasbergs and their exploitation financially of her.
Unbelievable. Well, we're going to get to that. The next thing I have here is I write little notes to myself. Don't use these words. So I'm bringing up a topic. Okay. I was so horrified, and we'll go into it later, but just in passing, how all of her doctors, medical and mental health doctors, used her. Oh my God, for professional advantage, for connections, for money, for just being adjacent to the stardom and stuff. Absolutely blamed her for the issues that she had that were out of her control. It was because of the trauma in her life. I wrote textbook. She was a textbook case, and they just convinced her that there was something flawed about her, that she needed medication, that she needed this, she needed them. And they created this dependency, all sorts of dependencies.
In my opinion, this got started when she had the misfortune of meeting Lee Strasberg.
Yeah.
He's the one that said that she had to undergo analysis, Apparently, he was prescribing that for other participants in the studio, actor studio. And of course, it just so happens there was a therapist, Margaret Hohenberg, that was upstairs, in the same
Yeah.
building.
Oh, yeah. By the way,
I can't imagine that there was any kickback or anything. Can you? But all
this is
that
such
was
cult behavior.
it was, and Lee Strasberg did a lot of this himself, insisting that the method acting that he preferred, which a lot of people find total baloney, what necessitated your dredging up painful memories from your past. And all that did is keep her in a constant state of suspended animation.
Well, re-traumatization. Yeah.
Re-traumatization. And interestingly enough, when she was over making The Prince and the Showgirl, I know this is jumping ahead quite a bit, but there was a period where Paula Strasberg was sent packing because of some laws in visa.
Yeah, she had to go back because of
so
the
she had to
visa.
go leave for several weeks, and that movie shooting sailed along beautifully while Paula Strasberg was not present. And if only Laurence Olivier, who was kind of in charge, on Marilyn's payroll, by the way, had held firm and banished Paula Strasberg from ever coming back, and just defied Marilyn, who by that time owned Marilyn Monroe Productions, and said, we're not going to bring her back. I think that there would have been enough financial leverage that Marilyn would have been forced to continue filming just to save her own company. But he blinked, and he allowed Paula Strasberg back. And I think that was a very tragic mistake in retrospect.
It was disgusting, and it was all levels of unprofessional and criminal. I was just appalled and it wasn't just the Strasbergs; it was all the people, everybody. It was predators.
There was one doctor who briefly saw her. There was one, a Wexler, who was not even a medical doctor. I think he was just, a psychologist.
Therapist or something.
But he saw her one time during Greenson's absence, and he was fairly sensible and suggested what she should do. There was also one in New York who briefly treated her, who also purveyed what I think was very sensible and responsible advice. But they were drowned out by the cacophony of Ralph Greenson, particularly, and also Hyman Engelberg, her MD. And, the part that I've gone into in the book, and we can talk about it in the future, that just cannot be missed, I want to make sure we mention it, is the deep involvement that these doctors had in the Communist Party.
Oh, unbelievable.
And Eunice Murray had been married to a communist organizer. And this is an unexplored aspect that cannot fail to be relevant to Marilyn's life story. And I don't know why other authors have been so, and I'm not trying to be smug about this, I just don't understand why they could overlook that.
Well, I think it's the distraction of the glitz persona, it gets lost because for a lot of people, it's a little bit too dry, a little bit too conspiratorial, maybe a little bit too egghead. They'd rather talk about her skirt blowing up over the grate.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly right.
yeah.
And
so
my effort, not to interrupt you here,
no,
but my approach was to provide historical context. I don't have a degree in history, but I do think of myself somewhat as a historian because it's so important to understand context. Most of the books that have been written, in fact, every one of them that I can think of, were written with just a focus on Marilyn without describing the context, what was swirling around her.
Yeah.
And you cannot understand her behavior or the dilemmas she faced. I mean, how many authors have talked about the MCA problem she got into thanks to the AG trying to entice her into cooperating and helping him when the Justice Department wanted to file an antitrust lawsuit against MCA.
I guess this is the place. This is the part where we say that we're going to be coy about some things.
Yeah.
And I think it is very apparent to people who watch my
Right.
channel, that these days there are names that you would rather the algorithm didn't hear coming out of your
Right.
mouth. So we're going to be talking with a wink and a nod and hoping that people
Right.
understand to whom we
And I
refer.
promise I will not mention the names.
Well, you know, if we do, we do, but we're trying.
But
I
the
started
original
to make
high-end sport. Okay, well, no, you don't have to.
I started to make a little list just for my own edification, just off the top of my head, and
Yeah.
I started at the end of the book because that's where I was when I started to make the list, and then I started remembering back and back and back the people. I titled this "The Crazy List of People," and this is just a small taste of some of the people who used her situation, her life, her death, her work, whatever, their adjacent relationship with her to benefit themselves to her detriment.
Mhm.
So we get the coroner in her case. We get Chief Parker of Los Angeles and Noguchi, who was also like the forensic doctor, the DA on the case. And then there's Eunice Murray and her husband, and I have in parentheses, communist organizer, Dr. Greenson, Dr. Engelberg, and he was a whack job if there was ever a whack job. Oh my God, allegedly. Hoover used her. There was a certain family from the East Coast who has a compound over there. They used her. It goes on and all the people in Hollywood and all, it's horrifying. This woman her vulnerability was her demise. I think it led to her demise because predators sniff it out.
Absolutely. In a sense, she was a professional victim, but also consider the fact that toward the latter part of her life, it was as if the scales had dropped from her eyes. And she was seeing people for what they were. She had parted ways with the Strasberg. She complained about them, even talked to her therapist about them. In fact, when Ralph Greenson came on the scene, her big problem was the Strasbergs, believe it or not. But she was jettisoning them, in the final day or two. She had fired Greenson. She had fired Eunice Murray. I believe she fired Pat Newcomb, her publicist.
Yeah, her PR person.
She was getting rid of people. She called George Barris, and we can go into that later, a photographer friend of hers, because he'd also been a publicist, not just a photographer. She sought out Rupert Allen, who had been one of her publicists. He had been, at that point, working for Grace Kelly, Princess Grace over in Monaco, but he was back in town in New York. He happened to be ill when she tried to reach him the day before she died.
Yeah.
But she was going to replace a lot of people in her life. So she did ultimately see the light. But I think that it was a slow process. It's not like she woke up one day and decided these people were taking advantage. She did have a gradual awareness. But I think that she was insecure enough that they were able to twist her and manipulate her. And by the way, I factor in the other possibility that she may not have been totally clear-minded. Greenson was an expert at hypnosis. She was hospitalized under false pretenses in New York by Marianne Criss, who inherited a bunch of money from her.
Payne Whitney, right?
Yes, Payne Whitney.
Unit,
as Marilyn said, Payne Whitney gave me a pain.
Me a pain.
And I delved into who specifically was treating her there. And that guy, and I name him in the book, I name names in this book, was also an expert in electroshock therapy.
Yeah, that struck me, the whole hypnotic, because conspiracy theories.
Yes, and it's even more the conspiracy theory. Why would she be seen by that particular doctor on staff? And people, Ernest Hemingway being the most famous example, and you know how he had a very dramatic ending after having a series of electroshock treatments. And it's very possible that Marilyn was not even aware that she was ever administered those things, because amnesia is a component of that.
And they kept her drugged up, didn't they?
Pardon me?
They kept her drugged up too.
Well, up to a point, yes. But she was also being weaned off of that at times. And I make a lot less of her drug dependency in my book than others do. I think it's been drilled into people's heads that Marilyn was out of control with alcohol.
Yeah.
You got clowns like James Bacon, who is so full of puffery. You can't believe anything this guy said, claiming that she was downing, bottle after bottle of champagne and popping pills.
And that wasn't true at all.
Nonsense.
When you see her, you know that she wasn't doing
exactly right. Exactly right. How could she have functioned? Eunice Murray even said that she was a light drinker. She had alcohol in her home, but it was for her guests and her friends. She would enjoy, and George Barris is another one. She would enjoy a glass of champagne, but she would drink a little. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's a little short.
A little split.
Yeah, split. That's what they call it, which is a small bottle. And she somehow managed to put a cork in that bottle. And friends always wondered, how did she
That's not easy to do.
And so does that strike you as being somebody that's a booze hound?
No, and when you look at her with kind of a medical eye, she doesn't have the telltale signs of somebody with long-term alcohol misuse. She was very disciplined about her diet and exercise and her skin care.
Absolutely.
Because that was her bank.
Well, I point out that Ralph Roberts talked about they would go jogging on the beach. Now, Ralph Roberts was like 6'3", very husky, muscular guy, had been in the military, had a distinguished career in the military, by the way, was a liaison between the Pentagon and the White House at one point. This is not a ignorant man.
No, you couldn't pull the wool over his eyes easily.
No. And he and she would go jogging along the beach. Now, you tell me how somebody would be drugged up or boozed up or both and be physically fit enough to be doing that.
Running on the
in her
beach,
latter days.
I tried to do that because, I grew up in California. Running on the beach is a singular kind of hell. It's very hard. Sand is not conducive to traveling over it easily. Yeah.
Being an adopted
shape.
Florida.
They would go for miles too. I mean, they'd end up in other cities.
They would.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, this is a stupid question. I don't know why I wrote this, because looking at it now, I realize this is an impossible question, but keep it in the back of your mind and we'll address it as we go along.
Okay.
Why the campaign to destroy her reputation? What was I thinking when I wrote that down?
Well, there were two reasons. The first was there was blowback from the public because she was the most popular actress in the world in 1962. Arguably so. She had won awards attesting to that fact. She was even bigger than Elizabeth Taylor, though Miss Taylor commanded a much bigger salary, disproportionate to her, what would be rational.
To the number of days she worked in a year?
Yeah, that's unbelievable. But Marilyn, when she had trouble with the studio, it was really an accounting problem. And, I delved into the fact that there were three cronies of that family.
When we call them
that family.
The large family with the compound.
Yes, they had three cronies that were in powerful positions, including chairman of the board of 20th Century Fox. Okay. And what they were trying to do is basically raid the company and get it in such a precarious financial state that they would be forced to sell the real estate. The land underneath it was worth more
than the studio.
Than the studio was. So it was very Machiavellian. And I do also identify a woman that was married to the AG whose family benefited from the sale of that real estate.
A woman who died recently.
Yes. Yeah. And who was connected also with Alcoa Aluminum, if you want to look it up.
Yeah.
But anyway, where were we going with this?
But just why the campaign? It was a multi-faceted campaign.
But there was a lot of negative comments in various columns, and the public was not liking that. They still idolized Marilyn. So studios were on the defensive. So we can kind of attribute some of that attempt to discredit her prior to her death by that fact. They were getting negative reaction from the public. However, what took place afterwards is the big revelation. That had political implications. It was necessary to discredit Marilyn at that point so that if ever leaked out, any of her statements were ever quoted by any of her friends that implicated anybody, it would be discounted because she would be portrayed as this hapless, helpless drug addict, an alcoholic, whom you just simply couldn't trust.
You could dismiss,
you see that in the way that they lied contemporaneously around the time of her death, claiming that she was in a fog, she couldn't perform her scenes, she didn't even know where she was, and they hid that for a long, long time.
Yes, they did. Wasn't it people like Dean Martin and other people that had worked with her fairly recently were saying that's not true? They stood up for her. People did.
They stood up for her,
up
to a point, but I still think that got lost.
That did get lost. I mean,
right.
I'm a casual observer of Marilyn Monroe in the past, and my impression of her was she was an alcoholic. She was drug addicted. She was not very bright. She was probably promiscuous. Her work was garbage, and she ended up. Her death was, her own responsibility. We can't say that word either, and I was completely wrong on all counts.
Well, ultimately, when film was smuggled in a trunk out of the Fox archives, which initially happened, there was a little bit of it shown to a Maryland fan club. And then a guy from Fox got interested in thinking, well, wait a minute, is there more film out there? When it ultimately, I think there's over 9 hours of film. My friend James Haspel, who befriended her when he was a teenager, claims to even have more.
That's the one you talked to. Okay,
yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, the revelation of seeing that film, some of which is on YouTube today, shows you that she looked radiant. She was sharp. She never once complained. She never threw temper tantrums. She was not foggy or in outer space. Everything they said about her performance was an unadulterated lie. Now, why would they do that? And that was after she died.
Well, I think that was my question.
Years.
Why did
it continued for years? Because they wanted to put a tight lid on her death. And you have the complicity of the LA police chief, William Parker, who got his job through blackmail. I go into that in my book. You have Noguchi, who would not be the normal person you would assign to have done that. He was a junior guy there. You have Lionel Grandison, who was framed. I've been in touch with his daughter, who gave me more information. What she gave me was validated by the declassified documents I was able to dig up, which, by the way, is an overlooked asset.
Now let me interrupt you and just refresh my memory. He was the ambulance guy?
Lionel Grandison worked at the LA morgue.
Okay.
He came to work that morning, saw Marilyn Monroe's name on the list, and wondered, where's the body?
Oh, that's right.
He tracked down her body, and he destroyed the plant. It was Ralph Greenson and Peter Lawford who said that the police should take her to the morgue, and they knew that was not protocol in a suspicious death, particularly of someone famous.
Somebody so famous, yeah.
Her body was to have gone to the city morgue. Right. Fortunately, Lionel Grandison was the hero of that. He intercepted it. He dispatched, and I have internal memorandum. I can even tell you the exact minute these guys and who they were dispatched to the funeral home. They were getting ready to embalm her.
And that would have been it.
Yeah. For getting her out of her house in a hurry, because it's much harder to do an autopsy when the body's been embalmed.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if they didn't keep the blood. So
especially toxicology. Yeah, toxicology.
He interrupted that, so they had to destroy him in the next week and claim he stole and all that kind of stuff. They did the same thing to James Hall, the ambulance attendant.
That's who I was thinking of, yeah.
And James Hall took 14 different lie detector tests. John Brennan, who was the former intelligence chief in the Obama years, commented in recent times that lie detector tests, polygraphs, are still used by the CIA to assess the credibility of sources. Yeah. So they still have some validity. They're still regarded that way.
Oh, well, they give them to agents in the FBI every year.
Also sex offenders to make sure that they are complying. I quote a judge saying it's the gold standard. So don't tell me that the 14 independent lie detector tests that James Hall took are all bogus. He told a very credible story. And not only that, in my book, I provide corroborative testimony from people at the ambulance company. The records reveal that he was employed by the Schaefer Ambulance Company at the time he said he was. I have the two original attendants who handed off the assignment to James Hall.
Because he was closer, his ambulance
because
was
they were
closer.
closer, they were within blocks. I also have interviews and quotes from other personnel at the ambulance, Schaefer Ambulance, who said it was the talk of the place the next day that Marilyn did not die of a drug overdose.
Oh no, we're going to get to that.
I know. So anyway, James Hall, and I did want to say one thing. I was going to share with you three things. I don't want to have, because you're in charge here. I didn't want to share all.
You mentioned that you.
I wanted to share three things that are not in my book, that are exclusive to your podcast.
Okay.
And you can promote it. My time on ABC. Tell the world. I don't care.
Okay.
But anyway, one of them is that James Hall's partner, who was actually the driver of the ambulance that was dispatched around 10:30 p.m. the night Marilyn succumbed, his name was Maury Leibowitz. And for a while, he disputed James Hall's story. Then he changed his name and laid low. But I'm here to tell you that in 1993, he did service, he did validate what James Hall said. And I should have put that in the book. That's one thing that I will do on an amended future copy. But that was a very significant admission. That James Hall.
Well, it's an alternate support, an alternate validation. But I absolutely believed what the information coming out of James Hall. There was a ring of truth to it from the very beginning, I thought.
Absolutely. His father was a distinguished physician. His mother was an ER room nurse. He had a pretty impressive pedigree. And we can save that for another time. A couple of the things I wanted, you mentioned J. Edgar Hoover. I neglected to put this in the book, but I think it's kind of worth noting. J. Edgar Hoover was very well liked by his neighbors, very kind man. Full of social graces, would write thank you notes and so forth. And he had a very beautiful home. And people who were at his home remember the rec room, as they used to call him, in the basement of his home. And as you would go down the stairs to the rec room, there on the wall was a big poster of Marilyn Monroe. He was a Marilyn Monroe fan. Now, a little postscript to that is, and I do believe this story, there was a neighbor boy, a teenage neighbor boy. Maybe you've heard this story. Not many people have. But J. Edgar Hoover, as leisure would have it, liked to putter in his backyard. He had a lot of flowers and so forth in his backyard. He was watering his flowers one day when the teenager, I've forgotten how old he was, but he's like 17, 18, talked to the director over the backyard fence because they were friends, families knew each other. And the boy point blank asked him, what happened to Marilyn Monroe? And J. Edgar gave the answer that I can't repeat because it involves the family I can't name. Now you could scoff at that and say, oh yeah, what a BS story. But stop and think about it. Had that teenager ever gone forward at that time and tried to interest the press in printing that, do you think anybody would? It'd be very easy for the director of the FBI to scoff and say, that's just a fanciful imagination.
Oh, go behind scenes, put pressure on the family to make your kid shut up.
Or whatever was needed. So I totally believe that this guy did that. I have a little different take on J. Edgar. I deal with it to some extent with the book. I think that he did favors for Robert Kennedy only up to a point. And there was a line he would not cross, and I illustrate that in the book. So one of the most popular authors, whom I refuse to name, but probably the best known author of a Marilyn book, also wrote about J. Edgar Hoover. And he came up with a cross-dressing story, which is also ludicrous. It's sourced to a woman whom Hoover put and Rikers Island, which was a maximum security prison and a mental institution. She had a long history of mental
So
disorder.
let me ask you, are you saying that rumors about his because it's not sexuality, it's behavior, but rumors about cross-dressing are false? I mean, that
I think when you see how I presented in the book and who the sources were, I think you believe that.
Do you know, I don't remember that. I'm pretty good about remembering stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
In addition to that, there were people that came forth and defended Hoover who actually had a contentious relationship with him. And you would have expected, would have readily bought
did
in.
him to feed on it, yeah.
But they said, I hate the guy's guts, but this is a ludicrous story. And the author was warned by a high official, don't go there because we've checked it out. This is not true. And he went ahead and not only appeared in I think it was a Frontlines documentary on Hoover, but he also has it on the dust jacket of his book, The Flaps, promoting this woman who is an absolute fraud. So this is the kind of author you are supposed to trust when he talks about Marilyn Monroe. And I have it in my book that Ralph Roberts upbraided him, confronted him about having stated that in the final weeks of Marilyn's life, she was twisting in the wind and sorrow and bitterness about her breakup with the family.
Yeah.
And Ralph Roberts said nothing could be further from the truth. You printed the exact opposite of what I told you.
Maybe there already is one that I'm unaware of, but I think Hoover, a really honest biography of him would be very interesting. Very, very interesting. I don't know anything about him. That's the only thing that's what you're saying is false. That's the only thing I ever heard about him, really. And I totally judge his character based on his fake hypocrisy, if what you're saying is true, because he really went out of his way to be cruel to the gay community in especially in the 50s.
Oh yes,
and I thought, well, that's hypocrisy, isn't it?
Yeah,
but
I'm not defending him in all respects. I'm saying that this is another one of those complex people. We can cite any number of politicians who have achieved great things. I mean, my goodness, people throughout history have had feet of clay, and they do great good, but the capacity somehow exists within them to do great bad.
Talk about it all the time. I have people that I admire, and then somebody will tell me this awful thing about them, and
well, even in Sarah's book, a lot of her book also pertains to Dorothy Kilgallen's investigation of the Kennedy assassination, and she shows you where Hoover blew the whistle and said Oswald was not in Mexico City. We can prove he was not in Mexico City, when the CIA kept saying he was. A whole bunch of stuff that he would not go along with. So even in the Maryland case, he closed down some things that were attempted against Maryland also. And that is in the book. So
I tried to count. We should probably end this here, and I know we are going to go back and get together again and go over. We barely scratched the surface. I knew that was.
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't anticipate my life story. I could have started. I was born in a log cabin and walked 5 miles to school, but I left that part out.
To, but I didn't want to push it. I'm always nosy. I like to know about what makes people tick. So. What was I going to say now? I just lost my train of thought. I think
people, I want to take just a quick second and commend you. I have never seen anybody review a book like you have, Helen. I think it's at least 20, maybe 21 installments, about an hour each, so meticulously gone through. You hit the highlights. When I watched you, and I watched every one of them, I actually learned things. I had forgotten some of those things that were in my book.
Obviously, I have too.
Writing the book was about a 5.5 year process.
Yeah.
And I wrote it chronologically. So I have kind of filed away in the back of my memory some of the things from the early part of the book.
Well,
And
so
we can talk about all kinds of things. I think, even her trip to Korea is a day-by-day account. There's so many fascinating things. The book is not all full of controversy and intrigue. There's all kinds of fun stuff in there and humorous, laugh out loud things. So I want to make sure people understand that we're not just talking about
one of the parts that
book,
one of the things I don't remember. I have memory issues. I swear to God, and I have selective memory loss sometimes. But I'm terrible with names. It's just it's pathological, and I don't know why that is. But one of the things that I remember so clearly in the book is the story of Elizabeth Taylor in Rome. I just, because I'm a little Elizabeth Taylor adjacent. I worked in a hospital in Los Angeles, close to the airport, and she was once brought in off of an airplane and was our patient. Now, I wasn't allowed in the room. I never met her. I saw like managers and handlers and PR people, but never her actually. When she left, she was very nice to the staff. Mm-hmm. And when she left, she gave everybody gifts. I got a beautiful bottle of like very expensive perfume, and I had nothing to, I was nobody. So I want to put that out there that people are complicated, but the story of her not showing up for filming for Cleopatra 100 days in a row or something.
Well, how about the birthday party that they gave her? The elaborate birthday party.
I forgot about
Marilyn's
that.
Birthday party on June 1st of 1962. She had to pay for the coffee, and they were drinking out of paper cups.
It was like
and they got
an afterthought. Yeah.
And her stand-in, Evie Moriarty, bought a sheet cake. That was Marilyn's, And by the way, there's so much to tell, but Lloyd's of London wanted Liz Taylor replaced with Marilyn Monroe at one point.
Yeah, I know.
So you want to talk about who's more dependable or not dependable?
Yeah. I thought that was so interesting. It just cracked me up too. Yeah. Hollywood today doesn't interest me. Hollywood of the past has so many more interesting stories. Like I said, I'm doing a book about old silent Hollywood.
That'd be great.
Yeah, the beginnings of Hollywood. And boy, is that rife with stories. God.
You know that Marilyn was advised even by that short little guy whose name I always forget. What was that name again? We just talked about him a little bit ago. The guy that was 31 years older, Johnny Hyde. He was advising her to watch silent films, one of the people, because those people had to convey expression, just expression, not dialogue.
That's right.
And so she was very conversant with silent films. And when a woman that was from the silent film era offered to loan her a gown, or not a gown, but a coat that would go with what she was planning to wear on a Frank Sinatra date, he was escorting her to a big gala event. She knew right away who that person was, and it was an obscure movie that she had seen her in. So Marilyn even knew silent films. This was not a dumb woman by any stretch.
She approached acting as an art form and a craft, but also a discipline, and that's I think missing for a lot of people. They just want the bank account, and the notoriety. Yeah. Which I take the bank account and remain anonymous. That'd be okay. Larry, I don't want to wear you out. I so appreciate this. I beg you to come back so we can continue in this book, because
let's do it at 3:00 today. I'm free. We can.
I have a thing. We barely scratched the surface. This book is like an onion. It's just so much in it. It's a fabulous book. So everybody go out and read this book, and then you'll know what we're hinting at when we're talking about people and that whose names we dare not speak. So we'll do this again soon.
Okay.
I
appreciate that very much.
Want to thank everybody who's watching, and please keep your eye open. Stay tuned. We will be back. That's a threat. So, slán go fóill, sláinte.
Excellent. Bye-bye.